Good morning, and thank you for joining me on the Path to Liberty. It's Wednesday, April 8th, 2020. Buried in all the bad news lately, and there has been a ton of it, is a small silver lining. Today we're talking about yet another delay in implementing the Real ID Act of 2005. The unconstitutional national ID program, an unfunded mandate, a privacy nightmare, whatever you want to call it. I'm going to cover that in this episode. But first of all, my name is Michael Bolden. We broadcast live every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 9:30 a.m. Pacific Time from here in my home office and studio in downtown Los Angeles for the 10th Amendment Center. We've got a bunch of platforms that we're on, both audio and video, live streaming and archived. You can find all of those, like the live streaming platforms, YouTube, DLive, Periscope, Twitch, Facebook, archive video platforms at Library, Brighteon, BitChute, BitTube, and then the podcast edition. I appreciate all the reviews that have been coming in on iTunes and elsewhere. That really helps us out a lot. Thank you very much for those of you who've been leaving reviews, and 5-star ratings have been coming in, and that helps us spread the word. So find all of those archives, all the different platforms, all the ways to follow us, all the show notes, links to stuff I talk about, and even ways you can support us, like our membership program, which starts as little as $2 a month. We make it go a long, long way here at the TAC. Find all of that over at the show homepage over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. Again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty, all spelled out. And before getting into this report, I just want to say a quick hello to everyone out in the live chat. Whether you're here live or in the archive, I'm grateful for you spending some time with me today. Tyler B., Michael Lur, Rivco Fireman, Heather Rossi, Essential Freedom, Brent David Fraser of the Sacramento Life Church Steward, over on YouTube, Michael Bogus, my buddy Robert Scott Bell. I'm going to cover a Real ID finally. He says, silver linings, gotta love them in the midst of all the crazy. So thank you all for joining me. If you have some questions or thoughts, I will look back at the live chat a little bit later in the show and maybe try to answer some questions. And then always, if you have some ideas for future episodes, things you want to hear about, feel free to email me anytime. I read all of them. Either myself or someone else reads all the emails. We don't get a chance to reply to all of them. That's team@10thamendmentcenter.com. And then I want a quick hello over to Bob Brewer, Mike Gangstead, and Nico Rando, Shane Lackey. Nico asks, what is the Real ID Act? Well, we're going to get into that in just a moment. Now, this is a bill that was passed in 2005 and was supposed to be implemented in 2008, but almost every single year they've delayed implementation due to a number of factors. And last fall, we got a real hardline deadline. They told us this is going to be implemented October 1st, 2020. Sure, I covered it on this show, or maybe there was a time when I was a guest on Robert Scott Bell's show. He does Monday through Friday at noon Pacific time, and then a Sunday show at, I think, at 10 a.m. Pacific time as well. So I was talking with Robert about this, and I told him, look, I'm still not going to comply. I'm getting this notice from the California DMV. I am not going to upgrade to this because they keep delaying implementation, and as long as I can, I will not participate in their unconstitutional national ID program. So last fall, they told us this is definitely going to happen. October 1st, 2020, if you don't have the new federally mandated ID card, you won't even be able to get on a plane, and eventually you're not going to be able to do all kinds of other stuff. So my buddy Joe Wolverton over at the New American wrote an article covering this, and this is the way he described it. I think it's eerily similar to what we're facing today. This is really interesting how he starts his article. He says, "Your papers, please." What image just came into your head hearing that? He writes, something straight out of Casablanca? A jackbooted, uniform-clad Nazi stomping someone on the street? Well, a similar scene is about to be played out in the airports of the United States of America, and I would argue actually much further, way beyond just the airports. And he says, what will bring this dystopian drama to life? Real ID. And over at the Cato Institute, they've been covering this probably more than anybody. They did a white paper on this, I think in 2014. Let me just double check here. In 2014, a policy update, state-by-state status on what was going on with this Real ID Act from Jim Harper. I don't think he's there anymore. But here's a quick overview. In 2005, Congress passed a law seeking to establish and steer all Americans into a national ID system. According to the federal government's plan, within 3 years, state motor vehicle bureaus would begin issuing driver's licenses and identification cards according to federal standards. So this was passed in 2005. It was supposed to be implemented by 2008. Most of us don't have these things yet. Going further, Jim writes, each applicant for a driver's license or ID would be subjected to mandatory facial image capture. So those of you who may not be following the Real ID issue on this particular show, I don't cover it nearly as much as I used to, but I certainly do a lot about surveillance, and I talk about facial recognition. And if you watched or listened to my episodes on this in the last few months, I covered how a lot of the surveillance came out of 9/11, the terrorist attacks. And they came out of the Patriot Act and the Department of Homeland Security. And they always were setting up this situation where they were going to do facial recognition on everybody. And part and parcel of that is the Real ID Act. They wanted to make sure they could scan everyone's face in order to be able to identify and probably track them. Going further, Jim writes, each Department of Motor Vehicles, DMV, would retain digital images of identity source documents as well. So they're just going to digitize everything and share all the information. Driver's licenses and identity cards would include a common machine-readable technology, and each state would provide all other states electronic access to information contained in its motor vehicle database. Wow, lots of information sharing, lots of surveillance technology, lots of advanced stuff in an ID in a time of fear. People were afraid. We always know that government expands its power most when people are freaked out and looking to government to protect them. Well, most of the time, government is hurting people, so I can't understand why they would go to that same entity to save them, because it's the wrong place to look. Jim gives a nice, quick overview of the history behind this. And he says the Real ID Act's effort to produce a national ID was one of 1,000 security ships that sailed after the terror attacks of September 11, 2001. Like many, it had no destination. Congress did not consider the complexities or costs of producing a national ID, and that's kind of a Cato thing. And I always have issues with that, and I just figure I should mention it. It doesn't matter to me. If someone's violating your rights, if someone's violating the Constitution, it doesn't matter if they're able to do it in a cost-effective manner or if it's not complex. And I think a lot of the arguments, this utilitarian argument that I get or I read almost all the time, and I'm not necessarily trying to go harsh on Jim Harper. Actually, I'm giving him a lot of praise for all the great work that he did for Cato on this particular issue. But I often see this argument like, oh, it's too expensive. Well, the price tag isn't the issue. The price tag, the Constitution is the issue. Your liberty is the issue. And if they're going to violate your rights, it doesn't matter if they can do it cheaply. So they always make that argument over at Cato, and I just wanted to get that aside, that distraction out of the way while I'm talking about it. He says, so they didn't consider the complexities, the costs, or the offense that a national ID gives to American values. I like that one. Nor did Congress consider its effectiveness as a security tool. Another utilitarian argument that I reject. It doesn't matter if they're going to make you more secure. If they're taking away your freedom, you've got nothing left anyways. Because we can only really truly be secure. We can only be happy when we're free. Going further, Jim writes, Real ID sailed through Congress in May of 2005 as part of a military spending bill. Surprise, we've heard this over and over and over and over the years. Every time they have a Defense Authorization Act or some kind of military spending, they sneak all kinds of garbage into it because it's a, quote, must-pass piece of legislation. And Jim covers this pretty well. He says that about the midpoint of the 2005 fiscal year, the military had been spending heavily, and an $82 billion spending bill, this was supplemental, to provide the military more money and to fund aid efforts after a devastating tsunami in Asia, was clearly going to pass. Opposition to it, even principled responses to important details, could easily be spun as, quote, not supporting the troops. And I think that's because a lot of people take the position that supporting the troops means spending a lot of money, printing a lot of money from the Federal Reserve, stealing money from every single person through taxation, and then sending the troops to do unconstitutional things. Now, really, if you're supporting the troops, you're demanding that the government follow the Constitution and bring those troops home, but that's another episode in and of itself. So that, I think, is a really interesting history. It created a national ID card that no one really should be required to do. And now over here from the American Institute for Economic Research, AIER, this is a guy named Peter Earle. I hadn't read any of his stuff before last year, but this is a really interesting piece, again in November, and I think this is what spurred Joe Wolverton to write about it over at New American as well. Peter writes, "The Real ID also represents the last mile in the ability of the state or the government to track individuals in real time. With various electronic, social media, and cell phone tracking measures, there is always a delay, and one can choose not to use social media, not to own a cell phone, and opt into other methods of extricating oneself from the prying eyes of the NSA or other government agencies. But the Real ID in particular, coupled with biometrics, eye scan, face scans, thumbprints, and the likes, fulfills Orwellian conceptions of the total surveillance state." And how are they going to use this? They're going to use it in all kinds of ways. I mean, I don't know exactly how, but we should expect the worst. And I think that should be the approach in basically anything that they pass. Anything that they pass, someone, whether right now or at a time in the future, is going to read that legislation in a way that is the most expansive power possible. Most power for them, most violations of your liberty at any way possible. They're always going to look at it like this. And Peter gives some examples. He says, expect it over time to be leveraged against individuals with outstanding traffic tickets, tax disputes, child or spousal support arrears, or behind on loan payments. He expects it to be tied to all kinds of data based on you. So you're basically going to have this card. The idea is the government is going to have this centralized card. And once you centralize it, then they can control how it's going to go rather than having a different system in Wyoming and Montana, California, South Dakota, wherever, South Carolina. That whole network is actually a positive. Of course, they sell to us as inconvenient. It's more difficult for the government to do the things that it wants to do. But certainly, anyone looking at the largest government in the history of the world shouldn't ever think that you want the government to do more of what it wants. It's already doing almost everything it does right now. It shouldn't be doing in the first place. But he goes on. He says that they're going to tie it to things like census data, drug prescriptions, and even library borrowing choices and habits are likely to eventually be linked with personal data associated with the new ID requirement. And if the ID is eventually accessible by the private sector, many individuals with innocuously tainted personal histories may become effectively unemployable. And I hadn't really even thought about this over the years as I had looked through Real ID when, as I mentioned, my friend Robert Scott Bell, I'm not sure if he's still on the show here on Facebook, but he has been talking about this for quite a while. He actually thinks that it's going to be tied to vaccine mandates. And when you get down to it and you see how things are playing out right now, that could be a very interesting approach that the government might use to force people to do things that government wants. And all in all, whatever the issue is, if they're tying it to this data, tracking people, facial recognition, and other biometrics, I think any constitutionalist can recognize the problems with that. And that's how Joe Wolverton, back to his article, we republished it. It was originally published at the New American back in November of 2019. I will link to it in the show notes. And he says it this way: constitutionalists will immediately recognize the real problems with Real ID. And he says, first, the federal government has no authority to mandate such national identification documents. I mean, there were no founders that ever talked about this. No one ever assumed that such a thing would be a power of the federal government. There is no record. You have to basically make it up. You have to look at the Constitution and twist it to fit your own desired goal. Joe says this federal overreach is such an obvious act of usurpation. That's a theft of power. St. George Tucker in 1803 called usurpation an act of treason against the sovereignty of the people. Sovereignty is final authority. So Joe says this is an act of usurpation that all state legislators should stand shoulder to shoulder in their resistance to such despotic designs. He said next, There's another aspect of the federal Real ID program that is perhaps more pernicious than the requirement of carrying papers proving you have the government's permission to travel. And I already have a friend of mine. She works up in San Francisco, and she is having her, like, she's still working. She's in an essential business, and she has a team who she manages, and they close their business at like 8 p.m. And I guess the cops have been showing up and checking them to say, well, where are you going? What are you doing? Well, I'm trying to get to my job. I don't have any other way to earn an income. And so what they're doing is they're basically, and maybe you've seen this in the news lately, a lot of people who are doing these types of jobs in this time of a shutdown, they're actually printing out a piece of paper from a business, from their boss that says, I work in this, I am an essential employee, I'm doing an essential business, this is where I live. In short, we're already seeing some glimmers of your papers, please, happening right now. Now, the Real ID Act is in essence trying to make that happen on a grand scale to everybody and potentially all the time. And it could be just a digital lineup, rather than someone physically doing it. They'll be more effective violating your rights doing it with technology, but either way, it's still the end result. So he says, there's this other aspect. This threat of liberty comes through the connection of Real ID to the growing federal surveillance apparatus. And that's where he basically discusses Peter's article from AIER, talking about how they're tying it into surveillance data, facial recognition, biometrics, and the like. I encourage you to read all those articles in more detail so I don't have to just basically read everybody's total pieces to you as well. But check those out. I'll link to them over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. Now back to Jim Harper, here from the overview from his report back in 2014. And this is part of the positive. He said states across the country rejected this unfunded federal surveillance mandate. Half the state legislatures in the country, this was as of 2014, passed resolutions objecting to the Real ID Act or bills outright barring their states from complying. And almost a decade later, this was in 2014, so here we are, 15 plus years later, we still don't have this national ID, and that's because so many states refuse to participate. And so every single year, because of a refusal to comply, it's an unfunded mandate. Congress passed this thing. They said states have to figure out how to implement this. A lot of states balked because of the privacy implications, generally from the left. The ACLU pushed the resistance on that. Then we also saw some resistance from more conservative quarters based on the funding, the fact that it's an unfunded mandate, and where are they going to get this in their already crushed budgets around the country. But a lot of states actually just said, no, we're not going to participate. And over and over and over, year in and year out, we were told 2008, it's going to be implemented. It didn't get implemented. We'll push it back a year. So sometime near the end of 2009, we were given a warning. If you don't do this again, we're going to implement it in 2010. And if you don't have your national ID at some time in 2010, you're not going to be able to get on a plane, go to federal buildings. And more states kept doing this. At one point on NPR, and I can't remember who the governor of Montana was at that time, but this was still at the end of the Bush administration's rule or reign in office. And they asked this guy, this Democrat governor, he's like, well, what do you think about this? They're threatening to say that the people in your state will not be able to get on an airplane. They're not going to be able to do this. And his response, and this is the mentality we need to have on everything, he said specifically, we feel it's best to just tell them to go to hell, and we're going to govern our state the way we want to govern our state. And today, even to this day, I believe, I've got to follow up on this. I haven't followed it closely in the last couple of years, but I believe Montana is still on the list of states that are not in compliance or full compliance. And this is an example. Here in 2016, in January 2016, we published another piece from Jim Harper, and he says on Friday, DHS Secretary I don't know how to say his name, Jay Johnson put out a press release backtracking on agency claims that the TSA would turn away air travelers from states that don't comply with the U.S. national ID law in 2016. Again, I can't say it enough. It was supposed to be implemented in early 2008, then 2009, then 2011, then 2012, and then it was every year that kept doing a delay of another year. They're not implementing, then they're not implementing. We'll allow you to apply for a waiver. And of course, everybody just applies for a waiver and then they don't have to do it. And we're talking about state DMVs applying for the waivers. We're not ready to implement this. And over. And this time in 2016, they gave a deadline of January 22nd, 2018. Jim puts it this way: that sure is not 2016. That's more than 2 years away. And if you look through the history of this, we've got a number of blogs on this over the years. Every year, it's basically the same thing. So here we go again. Here we just published, it looks like just yesterday morning, from Mike Maharrey, Real ID deadline extended for another year. Again, I think that's the best way to sum it up. He says the Department of Homeland Security has extended the enforcement deadline for Real ID again. This time, it's the public health emergency that serves as the excuse, but this is just one of many extensions, delays, and waivers that litter the history of this ill-conceived and, I would say, unconstitutional federal ID and surveillance system. Mike goes on. He says the DHS announced that it will extend the enforcement deadline another full year to October 1st, 2021. Quote, this is from DHS Acting Secretary Chad Wolf, said the federal, state, and local response to the spread of the virus here in the United States necessitates a delay. So even though this is the reason now, year in and year out, we keep getting told, I think they were actually getting pretty close to implementing, and at some point, people are either going to have to resist and not participate, or they're going to implement it at some point. But this, again, I'm just calling it a silver lining. Now, here's the interesting note. If you look into this a little bit further, and Mike dug this up for his article as well, as of last month, so maybe this was as of February, actually, only about 35% of IDs in the United States complied with the Real ID Act. And this is from CNN Politics. They call it a post-9/11 law that establishes security standards for licenses. They always make it sound so innocuous. But the fact remains, less than 35% of all driver's licenses in the country were compliant. And we're talking about something that they're saying if you don't have it by October, you can't get on a plane. So there was no way that this was going to happen anyways. They always like talking tough and scary when it comes to implementation and force and requiring their law to be followed. But when it gets down to it, if not enough people are doing it, it doesn't matter. And they actually go further. They say even before the outbreak, it was unlikely that all states would meet the deadline. Some surprising honesty and truth there. Last month, Acting Homeland Security Secretary Chad Wolf told lawmakers that the prospect of all states being able to issue their constituents a Real ID by October 2020 was, quote, probably fairly small. And mind you, Chad Wolf works for the empire. He's a lying criminal. And if he's going to do propaganda saying that it was probably fairly small, we can be sure that that number was like 0.0000001%. Like, there's just no chance that this was going to happen anyways. And they keep telling us we're just doing it because of this reason, that reason. They're basically claiming they're granting us extensions. But the fact of the matter is, if states and people aren't participating, it doesn't matter whether they grant us an extension or not. The people are resisting, and that extension doesn't matter. So, I wanted to sum it up real quick here from Mike Maharrey, actually, again. He says, the federal government's struggle to implement Real ID reveals a dirty little secret. The feds can't do anything when states refuse to cooperate. And I think I would just expand that on that. States and the people. Because you can't just rely on one government. The state governments are terrible, too. But you can't just rely on one government. So if for whatever reason people have been able to convince their state governments, or maybe economic concerns have convinced state governments to not participate in a federal program, that's good. But that doesn't mean when you get a notice, like I got a letter in the mail, I wish I had this thing handy. I know I kept this up here for a bit. I wanted to show you guys. No, I got my Real ID notice sometime, and I just did not want to participate. I'm like, I am going to wait to the very last second before I even consider participating in that thing. And I've got a passport for now. I'm just going to do everything I can, as long as I can, to hold out. And we'll see how it plays out. Maybe I'll come up with other ways to resist it further down the line, in another 2-3 years. But yeah, if you just rely on the government, they may flip the switch. Like in Utah, Idaho, and a number of places, they actually said they wouldn't participate in it when Obama was in office. And then when the Trump administration came in, all of a sudden they thought it was the most important thing in the world. So you can't rely on politicians. A lot of times the same politicians will take two totally opposite views depending on who's in charge in Washington, D.C. And that's really scary stuff. But Mike is absolutely correct that when enough states say no and enough people say no, there's not much the feds can do to shove these mandates down our throats. And he goes on. He says, this was the blueprint James Madison gave in Federalist 46 to resist unwarrantable, so that's unconstitutional, or even just unpopular federal acts. He said that a refusal to cooperate with officers of the Union would create impediments and obstructions that would stymie federal actions and render them nearly impossible or impossible to enforce. And Mike says this has certainly proved true when it comes to Real ID. At very worst, resistance primarily on the state level, some additionally on an individual level, at very least, just moderate, some kind of medium-level resistance has taken a federal mandate and pushed it back 12 years. I think we should apply this to just about everything. It shows that even without a strong level of resistance, a lot can be done. Now, if they were really great, if the states were run by libertarians or liberty lovers or constitutionalists, this thing would be dead in the water. We wouldn't even be having this conversation because this thing would have been done a long, long time ago. Anyways, let me take a look over in the live chat, take a look and see what some people say. Kyle Reese says, I can't renew my license without getting a California Real ID. That's over on Periscope. I should dig out mine because I know my license isn't due to be renewed, but I got a letter in the mail to say that I have an option. Maybe now that in the last couple of weeks, Kyle, that they've actually changed the so-called mandate, maybe the California DMV will change that up as well. We know they're closed right now, and that's a positive. So I would check on that. Feel free if you want to, Kyle, if you check into this a little bit further over the next month or so, email me, team@10thamendmentcenter.com. It's all spelled out, team@10thamendmentcenter.com, and let me know how that goes for you. Alan Hughes says, I refuse to participate. Great. Aaron Wright, replying to Rocks, seems good on my screen. Maybe you're not getting enough. Oh, someone's having some data issues. Yeah, you might just want to refresh. Can't read the text. It's blurry. I apologize for that. Sometimes it just doesn't come through great everywhere. There's a lot of people live streaming. Fenrir says the Montana governor was Brian Schweitzer. Right. I remember that. I was going to say it was Bullock, but that was Schweitzer was the guy who said, go to hell. That's the mentality that everyone needs to have. Now, certainly, Schweitzer wasn't going to say that to Barack Obama. And I'm not sure if he was around when Obama was in, but he was able to say that to George Bush. And that's fine to a degree. Like, we'll take what we can get at this point. As Thomas Jefferson said, the ground of liberty is to be gained by inches. And even though most politicians are only willing to do the right thing when it fits their own political goals or it matches their political party, or they can use the Constitution to bludgeon the opposing political party, we've got to really highlight that and push more and more people to get on board with that as well. Leslie Goody, this is interesting. My husband has a commercial license, and they did not give him an option to not have a Real ID. They just gave it to him without his knowing. What state are you in, Leslie? I'm curious about that, because a lot of states actually, some states have been trying to require everybody. A lot of states haven't done anything, and then a number of other states are basically giving you the option to choose one or the other. I would always choose the regular one over the surveillance tool, that is the Real ID Act. Darren DeLeon said the 10 safest countries in the world Global Peace Index for 2019, Iceland, New Zealand, Portugal, Austria, Denmark, Canada, Singapore, Slovenia, Japan, Czech Republic, and the United States is 128. Florida Tenther says Florida never balked. Only 2 legislators voted no, if I recall. And on issues when it comes to surveillance, the right is just terrible. They have no problems participating in unconstitutional federal programs. Leslie also said that she rejected Real ID in December when they were supposed to renew. Bob Brewer, this is a good point. Interesting that Real ID is tied to 9/11. I see the results of Building 7 grand jury. Sure, yeah, interesting. InfoSec guy says Real ID just captures your biometric photograph to give to the FBI in opposition to the Fourth Amendment and the 1994 Drivers Protection Act. I'm not familiar with that law, but I totally agree with you. And I'll dig that one up as well when I check the comments later. In opposition to the Fourth Amendment and the 1994 Drivers Protection Act, we need to abolish the government. It's our right. Kyle Reese, Patriot Act, absolutely right. And Leslie's over in Michigan. I don't know if there's an option in Michigan, but it sounds like from what you had to say that you did not have to get that. But it's interesting on the commercial end how they really tried to slam that through. Aaron Wright, good point. They will never do the right thing for the right reasons. And I think we always have to kind of keep that in mind. When we hear about a politician doing or saying something that we like, we shouldn't just become a cheerleader for that politician. No matter what the issue, we should always assume, or at least this is my default, we should always assume that they're doing it for political reasons. We can encourage them to do more of the same, whether it's for political reasons or not, but I don't think the default idea is that if they happen to agree with us like a broken clock once or twice a day or a year or an election cycle, we shouldn't think that they're good people. A lot of the other stuff that they're going to push through is really terrible. Oh, an InfoSec guy says the 94 Drivers Protection Act says the government, the DMV, has a duty to protect your information, not give it away. Oh, that's really interesting. Okay, I will look into that a little further, and I really appreciate your info on that. It's a really good summary to say, look, they're just going to create this giant database, facial recognition. The FBI's next-gen facial recognition database is really problematic. It's obviously unconstitutional, and this is a way to really build that up. And what are they going to use that information for? Even if they never use the Real ID Act to track people or tie particular information to the card, they're expanding this facial recognition surveillance tool, and we know when it comes to surveillance, the U.S. federal government is the worst government in the history of the world. And one more comment here. Michael Lur says Bullock Caves. This is in Montana. So Schweitzer said, go to hell. We're not going to implement this. It looks like the next governor, Bullock Cave, he says everyone hates him. I hope they do, because that's really a great approach to take to your own governor in basically every single state. Anyways, I hope you guys found this interesting. It's nice to be able to share positive news, even if it's only small steps forward, because I subscribe to Thomas Jefferson's view that the ground of liberty is to be gained by inches. We have to take what we can take when we get it, because he even recognized, and I'm paraphrasing what he had to say, this was in a 1790 letter to the Reverend Charles Clay. He said, look, a lot of people don't even know what's good for them, even when you put it right in front of their face. So we've got to keep pushing on. We're going to continue pushing on, and as long as they keep pushing back on this, I'm going to do a better job of educating more people, talking about this issue more and more, because it's very bad. Anyways, again, I hope you enjoyed this episode. I hope you learned something. I hope you are as safe, as healthy, and as stocked up as can be. If you support what we're doing on this show or the 10th Amendment Center more generally, make sure to smash the like button, subscribe, get notifications on iTunes or whatever podcast platform you may be on. Reviews help out a lot. All of those free actions trigger the easily triggered algorithms of the platforms you watch or listen on, and it tells the platform to show the program to more people. And if you really want to kick in, our membership program starts out pretty cheap, as little as $2 a month. I see a number of people out there that are already members. I'm very grateful for that. It's 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. I'll check more of the comments a little bit later today and reply to anything that may be interesting. Feel free to email me or leave some links, and I'll see you next time here on the Path to Liberty.